So we want to take some time for some questions. And Vanessa and Joni, I'm going to shoot the white elephant in the room, or whatever that's called. There's always lots of questions about the time that it takes for protocols to be submitted and approved. And I would just like for you to take a minute and maybe give us an example of one that went through quickly, one that might not have gone through quickly, and reasons for it. And I know as an individual, when you just are sure if you're having trouble, everyone else is having trouble.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
so just take a minute and talk about the time, if you would.
So timelines vary, okay, and some things that impact them the most are if we have increased volumes, but the quality of the application is also something that can impact the timelines. Timelines over the past year and a half have not been real good, and actually a lot of that has been due to turnover in our office, and there's such a steep learning curve that it probably takes an analyst about 2 years to get up to speed. But right now, fortunately, the timelines are better. And I'm pretty sure Exempt is back to running about 2 to 3 weeks.
I think less than 2 weeks.
Less than two.
Has been
Yeah, so
focused.
they're caught up, so about 2-week turnaround there, okay? That's the average. Expedited, I like to say 4 to 6 weeks, and full board 6 to 8 weeks. Now, the reason, a couple things there, okay? So what happens when your application comes in, it's gonna be screened by staff for completeness. You forgot this, you forgot that. If you forgot to submit your consent form, they're gonna get back to you. You have to submit all that before it can go for review. So just remember, all that takes time. Okay, then it's complete, then it can go for review. Exempt is quicker, expedited's 1 board member, but remember with SBS, I said that's where most of our work is. So if volumes are high, that can be delayed. Full board is longer because in the SBS world, we have 1 meeting a month. Biomedical and cancer meet every other week. But remember, so that comes in, it has to be screened. It's complete. It has to go on the agenda for a board meeting, which is once a month. And those materials have to be sent out to the reviewers 2 weeks before the meeting. Now, if you start to add up that time, that's a lot of time right there. So, what I tell people, just like you plan your timelines for your, your thesis or your dissertation, you have to plan here. So, what's your end date goal? Let's say graduation or finish your dissertation. Then here you need to say to yourself, when do I need to start collecting data in order to graduate in May? Okay? Then you need to ask yourself, when do I need to have that application into ORG to begin collecting data in January? And what you're gonna start to see is the time goes like that. So you have to plan your time accordingly. So, if you needed to collect data starting April 1st, when should your application be in our office if it's a full board review?
And of course, that has to do with the quality of what is
Yes.
submitted,
Yeah.
too.
So you're talking a good 2 months, okay? So that would mean like February, all right? And people don't typically plan that way, so you have to plan your time, definitely.
Any other questions about the time frame? Okay, let's. Oh, well, any more time frame questions? All right.
Good
What I was thinking it was on, it's not.
It is not. I'm loud anyway, so it won't be a problem.
I think we're fine.
Ignore the video.
So I should,
Just talk, don't have to yell, just talk quietly.
but then all right. So if personnel leave Ohio State, do they automatically go off of the IRB? Do they stay on it?
You have to notify our office. So if you have someone that was listed as key personnel or co-investigator and they have since left, you could submit an amendment to remove them. You can also do it at the time. I think that's the one thing you can do at continuing review is
Remove people.
Well, so what if we don't want to remove them? What
Oh,
if-
you don't want to remove them. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. So you want them to still be engaged in the research now
Yeah.
that they've left. You would want to still contact our office through an amendment process. We would then say that they're external personnel, and that's where our office would submit and negotiate an agreement with their new institution.
Gotcha.
Or with them. So we have IRB authorization agreements that we can do between institutions or individual investigator agreements if it's with one person. So sometimes people have external consultants, they're involved in something, then we would help get those agreements in place. But
Right.
yeah, an amendment.
But if that person is the PI, then you need a new PI here.
Yes.
Correct.
Even if they're going to somewhere else that they could do
Yes.
external IRB. So
Yep.
the PI on any IRB initiated at OSU must be
Yes.
affiliated with OSU.
Yes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I have a related question, kind of. I was just wondering for international research, if we're working with collaborators that aren't necessarily co-PIs in the field as consultants, do we also need to work with the IRB to get all of their external procedures or whatever
Yeah.
done? And does it always have to be in English?
International research is a little trickier, okay? And I always like to say because of that and the special circumstances, you probably need to allow a little more time for international. Now, we really have to look at each case individually. This is why. So, with our FWA, Federal Wide Assurance Number, you're doing research under the umbrella of Ohio State, okay? Now we're extending that and letting you go over there and do research under the umbrella of Ohio State. So you as the researcher need to find out what is the context over there. What are their requirements? Because even though we're gonna oversee the research, because you're a faculty or student at Ohio State, we have to know if there's any other external requirements from that. They also have to do our city training and do a conflict of interest. Sometimes there could be language barriers because of that, and we've actually come up with other things that people can do. But it really has to be looked at on an individual basis. But anyone over there that's engaged in the Ohio State research, back to that word engagement, has to be on the Ohio State study,
Okay.
okay?
Since I have the microphone, can I ask another question?
Sure.
So, another question I had was related to, I think it was you that was talking, but with the exemptions, I was a little bit confused between the exemption and the expedited for focus groups. Because on one of the slides it had been mentioned as exempt if you're just doing focus groups, but then the researcher would be involved. So I was just curious as to.
Okay,
Yeah.
so a focus group could be exempt or expedited, okay? It would depend more on what the topic is and who the population is. But it's not always just, like we don't say focus groups can always be exempt because of the nature of the topic.
Any more questions? Wait a minute, let's capture it on the video.
Related to international research, so if I start an ethnographic study in another country, but it's not with another institution, so there's no institution involved, it's just a community that I will be working with. Will I be able to take this data with me that I got the IRB approval for from OSU, continuing on to like another
goes back again to like the data use agreements. And you would have to go through that process to get permission to take that data.
Yeah, we have a lot of students that end up getting jobs, all, stuff they're working on here, and it's their kind of pilot data that they're doing, and they want to grow and expand on it when they move to their own position at a different institution. It usually is not a problem whatsoever. You just have to get the right agreements in place.
So I have a question about this. So I think you had said, Joni, something about the consent form, that the form cannot say this data will only be used at Ohio State. Do you recommend students putting something in that consent form that might make that process easier for them to take the data with
I
them?
always tell people to think long term. We have a lot of folks that move around, and maybe initially you have no intention of wanting to take it with you, but when people put really strict things in the consent form that it's not required to be in there, you have flexibility with that to explain who has access and what's going to happen with it. And we have folks that say, it may be used for future research that we just don't know of yet, and that's actually okay, and the board approves that. As long as that's in there and the individuals go, yeah, no problem, I don't care what you do with it, not a problem, but you have to be thoughtful about that. And we run into this a lot in like data repositories and like specimen research, because they think like, oh, only the researchers here are going to use it, and then they're like, well, it's valuable information, and we want to be able to take that wherever we go. And it does become very complicated, and legal has to get involved sometimes when we said, well, we didn't tell people that. So
Well,
think long term.
Yeah, and the feds now require sharing of data after the fact,
Yeah.
unless there's
Yeah.
an explanation for why it can't be shared.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah, being real constrictive on that consent form is not a good idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and just remember
Be
too,
transparent.
with the consent form, for all practical purposes, you can do what you wanna do, you just have to tell people. That's the purpose of the consent form. So, can people's information be identifiable? Sure, it can be, but you have to tell people that your information will be identifiable. Let's say you're doing a couple case studies, and when you write them up, you want to use the people's names. Can you do that? You can, if you have their permission, okay? Some people like to have their names written up in it. But it's just a matter of you have to tell the participants what you're gonna do.
And I'm gonna add something to that. You have to be, if you're trying to work with a population that you could have trouble consenting, that the numbers, let's say you wanna get 50 people, but it's probably gonna be tough. You can't, I'm thinking of a specific situation, you might have to go to 4 school districts or 10 school districts to be able to get the people that will allow you to do what you want to do to them. And so, so just because the harder, well, I think you're getting my point. You just can't say, I'm gonna work in Columbus City schools. What happens if you can't get enough people to get into your study? There's all sorts of things to.
Right. And those are research issues, quite honestly, there's anything that's not an IRB issue.
Oh, I guess you're right.
Yeah, no, I don't mean it that way, but I'm just saying, not parents that won't return permission slips for your research, a school that says no, they don't want you in there doing research. Absolutely. Those are logistical, systematic things with your research. So in that way, you gotta decide what you're gonna do as far as research. And if you're gonna be in those situations, it's gonna be more difficult. But those are not technically human subjects protections issue. Okay.
So any other questions?
Yes, I just wanted to know, do you send a reminder about the reporting that we have to do annually? Or do we need to put that on our calendars and?
You should put it on your calendar, but there is actually, the system does send out reminders. I think it's 90 days, 60 days, and 30 days.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is an IT system, it has its glitches too, so, I mean, but for the most part, we do send out reminders, via email.
And also, second question, if you have students who are working with coded data only, not personally identifiable at the point that they are entering the data, do they need to be entered in as key personnel?
Yeah. Encoded versus anonymized and all that gets kind of, some people use them interchangeably and
Yeah.
de-identified, so.
Yeah, they do though. If they're dealing with the data, they need to be on the protocol. And it's important to remember that if you have a code, okay, if you're doing a study and you're gonna follow up with people, you have to have a link, right? If you have a link or a code, it's not de-identified.
So if we have participant numbers and, no names, no demographic information on the data that they're entering, but this is participant number 25,
Who has access, but because there's a code, that's her point, is because there's a code to
That's a
it.
code.
It's linked, someone within the research team knows who those people
Right,
are, so at
right.
that point in time, you can't say it's de-identified.
And so those students are then put in the IRB protocol under key personnel.
Yep.
And so they have access to the
Mhm.
electronic IRB protocol
Mhm.
and can make amendments and all that.
Yep, yep,
I
can
have-
delegate all sorts of stuff to it.
That's what I like.
What?
I have.
The PI has to approve of
Yes,
it.
that's
Okay,
true.
'cause I think
Yeah.
I want those students
You can
to
have
go
them
in
do all the
and
work, but you have
They
to
can fill out
oversee
things
it
in
and
the
make sure it's
system.
correct, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, gosh.
Any other questions?
I actually have a follow-up, a de-identification question. So, I work a lot with, remote clinical genetics studies.
Okay.
So, whether or not you really need an IRB for this, the people running the repositories have decided that they're gonna require everyone to get IRBs. So the data is de-identified, even though there are keys that will link the genetics and the clinical and whatever all information we have, only because no one here knows who it is, and that's what makes it de-identified.
So the repository is external to OSU? I'm sorry,
DB
sometimes
do
it's
you
all,
know
it's
what
all
DB
about.
Do you know what DB-GAP is? Yes.
Where's Sherry when we need her? Yes, we are well aware of DB-GAP.
All right, so
And we're gonna actually, our policy committee meeting on Monday is talking about some language and some guidance we're gonna put on our website about DB-GAP.
okay, that will be useful.
yeah, it
But
has
so
to
the
be, yeah.
DB-GAP data does have every kind of key of different kinds in it.
Yes,
But it does qualify as de-identified, am I correct in this?
it does, depending on what they provide you back and what you, so with specimen research and like research that has PHI, it gets kind of tricky as far as who's engaged in the research, who has access to those identifiers. If you're going out into some commercial entity, so let's pretend DB-GAP is a commercial entity and you just want specimens or data on this particular population and they provide it to you for cost, for free, whatever, you're not getting any identifiers, they're not engaged in your research, there's no award going back and forth that you're sharing with the government. It would be almost equivalent to purchasing it from a commercial entity. So a lot of this gets complicated, and I honestly, we have someone in our office who is the guru of dealing with DB-GAP, so I don't want to speak out of line because it is not my area of expertise, but Sherry Petty in her office has been working, especially a lot with the genetics folks, on all these requirements and what the relationship is and what type of approval we would need here or not need here. But you're right, DB-GAP has codes. The institution holds the code, but you as someone not related to the other institution can say, I want samples or data on everybody with breast cancer, send this to me in a de-identified format, which could qualify as not human subjects research. But that's where we would absolutely recommend that you contact our office to kind of talk through.
Well, I mean, so in the case of DB-GAP, whether or not we think it's human subjects research, they want it to go through the IRB. That is
Well,
their.
then that would be what you need to do.
Yeah, no, so so I didn't have a question of whether or not I need to go to the
okay.
IRB on this. The question was what counted as de-identified and all of that, but.
Well, and partly because I think the information they're getting is coded. Because they're requiring institutions to maintain some code, because if you, as a different researcher, find some genetic anomaly that could be valuable to those participants who submitted their, their samples for analysis, and it would benefit them to know this new information. They want to be able to go back to the host institution and say, hey, subjects number 1 through 25, we found out some interesting information. It may be a benefit to them and their sibling or their whatever to have this information, and the institution has to have policies in place for how we're going to communicate that back to participants and whether or not we would partake in that. So institutions are supposed to have the codes. So that may be why they're asking for folks to have IRB approval, because they can't completely separate that link based upon just the ethical background of what they want to be able to fulfill for the participants.
Thank you.
It's complicated. Call Sherry.
No, really do. It's PETTEY.6. That is really who you should talk to.
All right, it's 10:21, we're about ready to finish up. One last question. I'm sorry, 11. It's almost 11:30. Go. Okay, well, thank you again,
Yeah.
ladies.
Thank
Yeah.
you.